When liberation comes to a place of unimaginable suffering, what happens to those who caused that suffering? In April 1945, British forces discovered a concentration camp in northern Germany that would forever change how the world understood the depths of human cruelty. But this discovery also raised a fundamental question about justice. How do you hold accountable those who have systematically dehumanized, tortured, and murdered thousands of innocent people? The story of what happened to the guards of Bergen-Belsen is not just about punishment. It's about humanity's first major attempt to define justice in the face of unprecedented evil. It's about ordinary people who became instruments of terror, and how a world struggling to comprehend the magnitude of their crimes decided they must answer for what they had done. This is the story of liberation, revelation, and the complex pursuit of justice that followed. Discovery phase, the moment of reckoning, April 15, 1945, the day the world saw hell. The morning mist hung low over the German countryside as soldiers from the 63rd British Anti-Tank Regiment approached what they believed was a prisoner of war camp. Intelligence reports had mentioned Bergen-Belsen, but nothing had prepared them for what they were about to witness. Lieutenant Colonel Mervyn Gonin would later write that no training, no experience from years of warfare could have prepared him for what lay beyond those camp gates. The first indication something was terribly wrong came from the smell, a nauseating stench that grew stronger with each step toward the entrance. The initial contact came when a German officer approached under a white flag, speaking rapidly about typhus and disease. The British officers, focused on military protocol, were still thinking in terms of combat operations and prisoner exchanges. They had no framework for understanding what they were about to encounter. As the gates opened, the first sight that greeted them defied human comprehension. Bodies lay scattered across the compound like discarded refuse. Not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands upon thousands of corpses in various states of decomposition. Some lay in organized piles, others were scattered where they had fallen, and still others were heaped in mass graves that had been hastily dug and left open. But perhaps more haunting than the dead were the living. Skeletal figures moved through the camp like ghosts, their eyes sunken so deep they seemed like hollow sockets. These survivors, if they could be called that, weighed as little as 60 or 70 pounds. Their striped uniforms hung on frames so emaciated that the fabric seemed to float around empty spaces where human bodies should have been. Medical officer Captain Derek Sington recorded his first impression. "I have seen many terrible things in this war, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for Bergen-Belsen. It wasn't just death, it was the systematic destruction of human dignity on a scale that seemed impossible." The British soldiers found approximately 60,000 people still alive in the camp, though alive was perhaps too generous a term. Most were suffering from typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and severe malnutrition. Many were so weak they could not stand. Others had retreated so far into psychological trauma that they no longer responded to their surroundings. In the days immediately following liberation, the death toll continued to climb at a staggering rate. Despite the best efforts of British medical personnel, approximately 500 people died each day in the first week after liberation. Their bodies, already pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, could not recover from months or years of systematic starvation and abuse. The British forces quickly realized they were facing not just a humanitarian crisis, but evidence of systematic mass murder. This was not the result of wartime chaos or supply shortages. This was deliberate, methodical destruction of human life. Among the living dead of Bergen-Belsen were the guards and administrators who had created and maintained this hell on earth. Unlike their victims, these individuals were well fed, properly clothed, and in good health. The contrast was so stark that British soldiers later reported feeling physically ill when they saw uniformed SS personnel standing among the skeletal remains of their victims. The perpetrators, faces of systematic cruelty, the architecture of oppression. Before we can understand justice, we must understand the crime. Bergen-Belsen was not operated by faceless bureaucrats or distant administrators. It was run by individuals, men and women who made daily decisions that resulted in mass death. These were people who woke up each morning, put on their uniforms, and chose to participate in systematic murder. The camp's operation depended on a hierarchy of cruelty that extended from the commandant down to the lowest-ranking guards. Each level of this hierarchy made choices that contributed to the suffering of tens of thousands of innocent people. Josef Kramer, the commandant who enabled mass death. Josef Kramer arrived at Bergen-Belsen in December 1944, transferring from his previous position as commandant of Auschwitz-Birkenau. His background was not that of a sadistic psychopath, but rather of a methodical administrator who had learned to view mass murder as simply another bureaucratic task. Born in Munich in 1906, Kramer had joined the Nazi Party in 1931 and the SS in 1932. His early career in the concentration camp system began at Dachau, where he served as a guard. He was neither particularly intelligent nor remarkably cruel by SS standards. He was simply efficient at following orders and implementing policy. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, Kramer had overseen the murder of hundreds of thousands of people with the same methodical approach he might have applied to any administrative task. He organized transport schedules, managed personnel assignments, and ensured that the killing apparatus operated smoothly. When he was transferred to Bergen-Belsen, he brought this same systematic approach to mass death. Bergen-Belsen, under Kramer's command, became a place where death was not just common, it was inevitable. He made no effort to improve sanitary conditions, increase food rations, or provide medical care. When British forces questioned him after liberation, Kramer expressed no remorse, no recognition of the human cost of his administration. He spoke of maintaining order and following procedures as if managing the slow death of 60,000 people was simply another military assignment. What made Kramer particularly dangerous was not exceptional cruelty, but exceptional indifference. He had developed the ability to see human beings as administrative problems to be managed rather than as individuals with inherent dignity and rights. This bureaucratic approach to mass murder would later become a central focus of war crimes tribunals attempting to understand how ordinary people could participate in genocide. Irma Grese, the young woman who became a symbol of evil. Perhaps no single figure from Bergen-Belsen captured public attention like Irma Grese, a young woman whose transformation from farm girl to concentration camp guard illustrated how ordinary people could become instruments of systematic terror. Born in 1923 in rural Germany, Grese grew up in a family marked by tragedy and dysfunction. Her mother's suicide when Irma was 13 left her with an unstable home environment and few prospects for the future. At 14, she left school to work on local farms and in shops, showing no particular signs of the cruelty that would later define her. In 1942, at age 19, Grese entered the concentration camp system as a trainee guard at Ravensbrück. The training program for female guards was designed to break down normal human empathy and replace it with absolute obedience to authority. Trainees were taught to view prisoners not as human beings, but as enemies of the state who deserved whatever treatment they received. Grese proved to be an exceptionally dedicated student of this ideology. By 1943, she had been transferred to Auschwitz, where she quickly gained a reputation for extreme brutality. Survivors later testified that she seemed to take pleasure in inflicting pain, particularly on young women who reminded her of her former self. At Auschwitz, Grese carried a plaited whip and a pistol, both of which she used regularly on prisoners under her supervision. She was known for conducting selections, the process by which guards decided which prisoners would be sent to immediate death in the gas chambers. According to testimony from survivors, Grese often selected the youngest and most attractive women for death, as if their beauty was itself a crime that needed to be eliminated. When Grese was transferred to Bergen-Belsen in early 1945, she brought with her a reputation for sadistic cruelty that terrified even hardened prisoners who had survived years in the concentration camp system. At Bergen-Belsen, where the camp was collapsing under the weight of overcrowding and disease, Grese continued to impose brutal discipline on prisoners who were already dying of starvation and typhus. Survivors described Grese as someone who seemed to enjoy the power that came with determining who lived and who died. She would beat prisoners too weak to stand, forced sick inmates to perform exhausting physical exercises, and regularly used her guard dogs to attack anyone who displeased her. What made Grese particularly chilling was not just her cruelty, but her youth and apparent normalcy. At 22, she could have been any young woman in wartime Europe. Her transformation into an instrument of mass murder raised disturbing questions about how quickly ordinary people could be turned into agents of systematic evil. Dr. Fritz Klein, the physician who abandoned his oath. Among the most morally disturbing figures at Bergen-Belsen was Dr. Fritz Klein, a physician who had perverted his medical training to serve the machinery of mass death. Klein's presence at the camp illustrated how professional expertise could be weaponized in service of genocide. Klein had been trained as a physician in Romania before the war, taking the Hippocratic Oath to first do no harm. When he joined the SS Medical Corps, he brought with him the authority and knowledge of a trained doctor, but used these tools to facilitate rather than prevent death. At Bergen-Belsen, Klein served as the camp's senior medical officer, but his role bore no resemblance to traditional medical practice. Instead of treating illness, he participated in selections that determined which prisoners were too sick to be useful and should therefore be eliminated. Instead of alleviating suffering, he conducted medical experiments on living prisoners, treating human beings as laboratory specimens. Klein's medical background gave him unique insight into how the human body responded to starvation, disease, and abuse. Rather than using this knowledge to save lives, he used it to make the killing process more efficient. He could calculate precisely how long it would take for inadequate food rations to cause death, how many people could be crowded into barracks before disease would spread uncontrollably, and which medical conditions would cause the most prolonged suffering. Survivors later testified that Klein would walk through the camp selecting prisoners for death with the same clinical detachment he might once have used to diagnose illness. He showed no emotion when examining skeletal figures who were clearly dying, offering no treatment or comfort, even when simple interventions might have saved lives. Perhaps most disturbing was Klein's ability to rationalize his actions through pseudo-medical justification. He spoke of prisoners as cases rather than people, described mass death as natural selection, and claimed that his work served the greater good of German racial hygiene. Klein's case would later become central to discussions about medical ethics and professional responsibility. How could someone trained to heal become an agent of systematic murder? How could professional knowledge be so completely divorced from basic human morality? Josef Volkenrath, the supervisor who made cruelty systematic. Josef Volkenrath represented another troubling category of perpetrator, the administrator who made mass murder more efficient through careful organization and systematic brutality. Unlike guards who acted impulsively or commandants who gave general orders, Volkenrath specialized in making cruelty systematic and predictable. Born in 1919, Volkenrath had joined the concentration camp system as a guard in 1941. She quickly demonstrated an aptitude for organization and was promoted to supervisory positions at several camps before arriving at Bergen-Belsen. Her role was to manage the daily operations that kept the machinery of death functioning smoothly. Volkenrath was responsible for organizing work details, managing barracks assignments, and coordinating with other camp personnel to ensure that policies were implemented consistently. She approached these tasks with the same methodical efficiency that might have been applied to managing any large institution, except that the institution she was managing was designed to destroy human life. Under Volkenrath's supervision, the process of systematic dehumanization became routine and predictable. She established procedures for punishing prisoners, protocols for conducting selections, and systems for maintaining order through terror. Her administrative skills made the camp's murderous operations more effective. Survivors later testified that Volkenrath rarely showed emotion when carrying out her duties. She beat prisoners methodically, rather than in anger, conducted selections with bureaucratic efficiency, and maintained detailed records of deaths and punishments as if she were managing inventory rather than human lives. What made Volkenrath particularly dangerous was her ability to make extreme cruelty appear normal and systematic. Under her management, brutality became routine, mass death became administrative procedure, and human suffering became statistical data. Johanna Borman, the guard who weaponized animals. Johanna Borman represented yet another facet of the systematic cruelty that characterized Bergen-Belsen. A middle-aged woman who had worked in various camps throughout the Nazi system, Borman had developed a particularly disturbing specialty, using trained dogs as instruments of torture and murder. Born in 1893, Borman was older than many of the other female guards, and her age gave her a certain authority among the camp personnel. She had joined the concentration camp system in 1938 and had spent years perfecting techniques for inflicting maximum psychological and physical trauma on prisoners. Borman's signature tool was a large German shepherd that she had trained to attack prisoners on command. Unlike guard dogs used for security purposes, Borman's animal was specifically trained to maim and terrorize. She would use the dog to punish prisoners who were too weak to work, too slow to respond to orders, or who simply happened to displease her for any reason. Survivors later described scenes of horror in which Borman would release her dog on prisoners who had collapsed from exhaustion or illness. The animal had been trained not just to attack, but to prolong the victim's suffering, biting and tearing at flesh, while Borman watched with apparent satisfaction. What made Borman's cruelty particularly disturbing was its calculated nature. She had spent considerable time and effort training the dog to maximize fear and pain. This was not spontaneous violence born of anger or frustration. It was carefully planned and systematically implemented torture. Borman also used her dog as a psychological weapon, parading the animal through the barracks to terrorize prisoners who had not yet been attacked. The mere presence of the dog created an atmosphere of constant fear that added another layer of suffering to the already unbearable conditions in the camp. Her case illustrated how individual creativity in service of evil could make an already horrific situation even worse. The Nazi system provided the framework for mass murder, but individuals like Borman found ways to make that system even more brutal and terrifying. The liberation aftermath, chaos and spontaneous justice. When the oppressed became the judges. The immediate aftermath of Bergen-Belsen's liberation revealed the complex dynamics that emerge when systematic oppression suddenly collapses. In the power vacuum that followed the arrival of British forces, some prisoners took justice into their own hands, creating scenes that were both understandable and deeply troubling. The British forces were initially overwhelmed by the scale of the humanitarian crisis they faced. With thousands of people dying daily from disease and malnutrition, their immediate priority was saving lives rather than maintaining perfect order throughout the camp. This focus on emergency medical care created opportunities for spontaneous acts of revenge. Many prisoners had endured months or years of systematic brutality at the hands of not just SS guards, but also prisoner functionaries known as capos. These were inmates who had been given supervisory roles over other prisoners in exchange for better treatment. Many capos had used their positions to abuse fellow prisoners, sometimes with even greater cruelty than the SS guards themselves. In the chaos following liberation, some of these capos became targets of prisoner revenge. Groups of survivors, despite their weakened physical condition, managed to corner individual capos and beat them to death. These killings were not organized or systematic. They were spontaneous explosions of rage and pain that had been building for months or years. British officers later reported finding the bodies of several capos who had been killed by other prisoners. The scenes were disturbing not just because of the violence, but because they revealed the depth of trauma and rage that the camp system had created. People who had been systematically dehumanized were reclaiming their agency through acts of violence that mirrored, in some ways, what had been done to them. Some SS personnel were also targets of prisoner revenge in the first chaotic days after liberation. British forces were spread thin and could not provide complete protection for captured guards, especially those who were kept in the same areas as liberated prisoners. Several guards were beaten or killed before British personnel could establish complete control. These acts of spontaneous justice were both comprehensible and troubling. On one hand, they represented a natural human response to systematic abuse and torture. Prisoners who had been denied any agency or power for months or years were finally able to strike back at their tormentors. On the other hand, the violence perpetuated cycles of brutality that the liberation was supposed to end. British commanders quickly recognized that allowing uncontrolled revenge would undermine the moral authority they hoped to establish. If liberation was to represent a return to civilization and rule of law, it could not be marked by summary executions and mob violence, no matter how understandable those responses might be. Within days of liberation, British forces had separated captured SS personnel from liberated prisoners and established procedures for protecting all individuals in their custody. This decision was not popular with some survivors who felt that their oppressors deserved immediate punishment. However, it reflected a commitment to the principle that justice should be systematic and legal rather than spontaneous and emotional. The Belsen trials establishing precedent for justice, September 1945. The world watches justice unfold. 5 months after liberation, the world's attention focused on a converted gymnasium in the German town of Nuremberg, where the British military had established a war crimes tribunal. The Belsen trials, as they came to be known, represented one of the first major attempts to bring Nazi war criminals to justice through legal proceedings rather than summary execution. The trials were groundbreaking in several ways. They were among the first to use filmed evidence in war crimes proceedings, showing graphic footage of the conditions found at Bergen-Belsen. They established precedents for holding individuals accountable for crimes against humanity, even when those individuals claimed they were simply following orders, and they demonstrated that the Allied powers were committed to using legal processes rather than revenge to address Nazi atrocities. The prosecution was led by Colonel T.M. Backhouse, a British military lawyer who faced the enormous challenge of presenting evidence of crimes that seemed almost beyond human comprehension. How do you prosecute mass murder on a scale that had never been seen before? How do you establish individual responsibility within a system designed to diffuse accountability? Backhouse's strategy was to focus on specific documented acts of cruelty by individual defendants, while also establishing the systematic nature of the crimes. He presented evidence that Bergen-Belsen was not the result of wartime chaos or resource shortages, but was deliberately maintained as a place of systematic murder. The prosecution called dozens of witnesses, including survivors who had the courage to testify against their former tormentors. These testimonies were emotionally devastating but legally crucial. Survivor after survivor described specific acts of cruelty by individual defendants, building a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse. One of the most powerful moments in the trial came when filmed evidence from the liberation of Bergen-Belsen was shown in the courtroom. The footage showed the piles of corpses, the skeletal survivors, and the horrific conditions that had been maintained under the defendant's supervision. The impact on everyone present, judges, lawyers, defendants, and observers, was profound and immediate. The defense faced an almost impossible task. How do you defend actions that resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of innocent people? Most defense attorneys relied on two main arguments: that their clients were simply following orders and had no choice but to comply, and that the conditions at Bergen-Belsen were the result of wartime circumstances beyond anyone's control. The following orders defense proved to be legally and morally inadequate. The tribunal established that following orders could not excuse participation in crimes against humanity, especially when those orders involved systematic murder. This principle would later become central to international humanitarian law. The argument that wartime conditions were responsible for the mass deaths at Bergen-Belsen was contradicted by extensive evidence showing that the camp's conditions were deliberately maintained. The prosecution demonstrated that food, medical supplies, and other necessities could have been provided but were deliberately withheld as part of a policy of systematic murder. The verdicts. Justice measured and delivered. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the tribunal reached its verdicts. Of the 45 defendants tried in the main Belsen trial, 36 were found guilty of war crimes. The sentences ranged from acquittal to death, with the severity determined by each individual's level of responsibility and the specific nature of their crimes. 11 defendants, including Commandant Josef Kramer, were sentenced to death by hanging. These were individuals who bore primary responsibility for the systematic murder that had occurred at Bergen-Belsen. The tribunal determined that their actions went far beyond simply following orders and constituted active participation in genocide. The death sentences were controversial, even among those who supported the trials. Some argued that execution made the Allied powers no better than the Nazis they were prosecuting. Others contended that the scale of the crimes demanded the ultimate punishment and that anything less would trivialize the suffering of the victims. Other defendants received prison sentences ranging from life imprisonment to terms of several years. These were typically individuals who had participated in the camp's operations but bore less direct responsibility for the systematic murder. The tribunal attempted to calibrate punishments to match the level of individual culpability. Several defendants were acquitted, either because the evidence against them was insufficient or because the tribunal determined that they had not actively participated in war crimes. These acquittals were important because they demonstrated that the proceedings were genuine legal trials rather than predetermined exercises in revenge. The verdicts established several important legal precedents. They confirmed that individuals could be held accountable for crimes against humanity even when acting under orders from superior authorities. They established that systematic murder of civilian populations constituted a crime under international law, and they demonstrated that legal proceedings could address atrocities of unprecedented scale. The executions. Justice delivered with solemn dignity. December 13, 1945, the final accounting. On December 13, 1945, 11 individuals convicted of war crimes for their roles in the atrocities at Bergen-Belsen were executed at Hameln prison in Germany. The executions, carried out by Britain's chief executioner Albert Pierrepoint, followed strict British military procedures. The condemned were held in solitary confinement, offered religious support, and allowed to write final letters. These executions were not acts of revenge, but the fulfillment of legal sentences by a military tribunal, marking justice for their involvement in systematic mass murder. Josef Kramer, former commandant of Bergen-Belsen, was the first to be executed on December 13, 1945. Known for his emotionless efficiency in overseeing mass death, he showed no remorse during his trial or final hours, claiming he was just following orders. Calm and composed, Kramer offered no resistance and walked steadily to the gallows. His execution, carried out swiftly and professionally by Albert Pierrepoint, symbolized justice, not vengeance, for the atrocities he had overseen. Irma Grese, only 22 years old, was the youngest person executed under British law in the 20th century. Known for her cruelty at Bergen-Belsen, she remained defiant and unrepentant until the end, denying any wrongdoing. During her execution, she briefly resisted the hood, but ultimately complied. Her final word in German, schnell, meaning quick, reflected her desire to control even her last moments. Though her youth disturbed many, the tribunal concluded it did not excuse her role in systematic murder, making her crimes all the more chilling. Dr. Fritz Klein, a physician who used his medical skills to aid genocide at Bergen-Belsen, was executed for his role in systematic murder. Despite taking the Hippocratic Oath, Klein rationalized his actions as necessary for order and disease control, insisting even in his final hours that he had acted for the greater good. His inability to see the moral contradiction in his actions highlighted how professional expertise can be twisted to serve evil. His case later became a key example in debates on medical ethics and the importance of upholding moral responsibility, even in extreme situations. Josef Volkenrath, the administrator of systematic cruelty, Josef Volkenrath was executed for her role in organizing systematic brutality at Bergen-Belsen. Throughout her trial, she downplayed her involvement, claiming she had merely followed procedures to maintain order. However, her work had directly contributed to the efficiency of mass murder. She faced her execution calmly, without incident. Her case serves as a chilling reminder of how administrative and bureaucratic skills can be distorted to support genocide, showing that even behind-the-scenes roles can carry profound moral responsibility. The remaining 7 individuals executed on December 13, 1945, each embodied different roles within the system of genocide at Bergen-Belsen. Their participation varied, from guards who inflicted physical cruelty to administrators who managed logistics and medical personnel who enabled killing through their expertise. Despite their different functions, all had made choices that supported mass murder. Albert Pierrepoint executed each with his usual precision. Their reactions ranged from resignation to defiance, and in some cases, possible remorse. By midday, all 11 sentences had been carried out. While these executions could not undo the atrocities committed, they affirmed a crucial legal and moral principle: those who participate in genocide will face justice regardless of their claimed obedience to orders. Lessons for the modern world. The continuing relevance of Bergen-Belsen. The legacy of Bergen-Belsen remains relevant today as genocide and mass atrocities continue to occur around the world. Despite the hope that such horrors would never happen again, the international response to later genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and elsewhere has often been delayed or ineffective. Many of the same dynamics that enabled the Holocaust, such as dehumanization, bureaucratic complicity, and institutional failure, persist in modern contexts. Although the legal principles from the Belsen trials helped shape international law, enforcement is still inconsistent and influenced by politics. The International Criminal Court, while a step forward, faces limitations due to political resistance and lack of universal authority. The psychological and social mechanisms that allowed ordinary people to become agents of genocide remain active today. Modern technology, including social media, now amplifies propaganda and enables organized violence, showing that the dangers identified at Bergen-Belsen still require vigilant attention. A key lesson from Bergen-Belsen is the power of individual moral choice in the face of systemic evil. The camp's atrocities were enabled by countless personal decisions to comply or not. The Belsen trials reinforced that just following orders is not a valid defense for crimes against humanity, making clear that every person holds responsibility for their actions. This principle remains vital today, especially in conversations about corporate ethics, professional conduct, and civic duty. The example of those who resisted, often at personal risk, proves that even within oppressive systems, moral courage can prevail and individual choices can make a difference.